Welcome to the San Francisco Quantified Self Meetup. It always is, I think, revealing, at least to me, to have a show of hands of how many people this is your first Quantified Self Meetup. Raise your hand. Okay, so that's most of the people. This is actually quite normal for a lot of the meetups. So there's a lot of people that come through, and most people are newbies. And so in the spirit of that, I wanted to talk a little bit about the creation myth of quantified self, and then I'll talk for a few minutes about what I'm imagining right now, thinking about the future of quantified self. And then I think we'll do a three-word introduction. So just to be thinking while I'm talking, if you don't want to listen to me, what we do is we go around and everybody says 3 words about stuff you're interested in. You have just 3 words. Try not to hyphenate too many of them. And your name in 3 words. And we just go through very quickly. And with this size group, we can do this fairly fast. And it kind of gives you little beacons of where you might want to talk to someone later if they're doing something that sounds interesting to you. So that's part of this kind of mixing. But first I want to talk about where quantified self came from, because it's kind of an interesting moment where we've had the Bay Area quantified self, and now we have these little breakups. We've gotten too big, basically, to fit everybody in one room every month. And so what I am going to do is talk about the origins of it. So my co-founder, Gary Wolf, and I was one of the co-founders of Wired. Gary Wolf was a writer, someone we hired, who wrote, actually the first article he wrote was about this really kind of amazing thing called Mosaic, which was a browser for the web, and no one was really sure whether this was a fad or what was going on. So he wrote the first article about a browser, and we got to know each other. And in talking about things about 4 or 5 years ago, he was talking about data and the fact that there was all this data and people should do something with data about themselves. At the same time, I took a walk with Alan Green, who happens to be sitting in the back. Dr. Alan Green, who's a pediatrician in the Bay Area. He runs a site called Ask Dr. Green. And he and I were taking a walk, and Alan at that time was actually performing a very interesting experiment where he was completely organic. He had gone to a 100% organic diet. He ate nothing that was not inorganic, including during his travels. And so I was interested in whether he was measuring himself before and after this. And I got to think about the kind of tools that one would need to measure the changes that one would expect in your body if you went 100% organic. You should be able to see these things. And I was asking him about these tools, and he was basically saying, I don't know about these tools. And I'm thinking, there should be some site, something that is collecting all the tools that people are using to measure themselves. And Gary and I had a conversation about, hey, this is important, this is something we could do. It's kind of an easy thing to do, just to launch a gathering. And so we decided to post on Meetup. We just threw out and said, hey, we're going to meet and talk about the quantified self. We have no idea what it means. Come to my studio, and we'll talk about it. And if you're doing anything that you think is quantified selfing, come. And then we had 25 people show up, including someone I'd never met before, Tim Ferriss, who was, turns out to be the fanatical master quantifier selfer. And from there, every time we have a monthly meeting, there's more and more people. So one of the things that we're trying to do with this, and that we've been very careful about in structuring it, is that I still don't know exactly what quantified self is. The whole purpose of having these monthly meetings is to have everyone tell us what it is. So we're using this whole thing to define it. So each time someone comes up here and tells us about what they're doing, why they're doing it, and what they learned, which is what the format is, they are helping us to define what this quantified self business is. So we've had one conference last year. We're having another one coming up. It's very exciting because there's further and further defining of what this means and what this movement really is about. So rather than having a preconceived idea, we basically had a hunch. a direction, a general drift, which is obviously self-monitoring, self-tracking. But to what isn't and what is not, that's being defined by the people who show up here and give little talks. And it's a self-propelled movement in that sense. So we're kind of very hands-off. We have, as you know, meetings all around the world now. Each one who stands up is telling us their definition of what it is. And I have to say that having gone to these on a regular basis for many, many years now, I am completely surprised every single time. Because it turns out that basically people are measuring stuff that they're interested in, and so the interest of people is almost infinite, and there's no end to what people will attempt to measure. And so they're measuring things that they care about and trying to figure out how you do that. So that's the one thing that we see happening is people thinking about, well, how do I quantify something that I care about? How can I measure it and then use that measurement to do something with it? So that's sort of where we've come from. I'm still, yeah, I have my Fitbit. Actually, I just lost my Fitbit. I rode my bicycle from Vancouver down to San Francisco with my son and nephew. It was 1,300 miles, and I had my Fitbit, and then one day it was gone. It was actually the second one I lost. I know there has to be some way to anchor these things so they don't fly off out of your pocket, but I wasn't doing that. So, but mostly I'm here to understand, as I'm an editor type. I'm here to understand what this means. What's the meaning of this? And in that way, I have a couple thoughts about what I think this trajectory is so far, given our short little history. And so I just want to, in a few minutes, just talk about some general trends and the general trends forward. So the thing about Quantified Self is that it's two words. And so I want to talk about the two halves. I want to talk about the quantification and the self. So the quantification that's the first word. That's what everybody is kind of really focused on, and that's where it's the most surprise. We have, of course, increasing tools, and I'm somebody who believes that actually science is changed by the tools. When we had a microscope and a telescope, that really opened up worlds that we were unseen before, and new tools give us new questions, and it's the questions that bring us answers, and those answers can give us more questions, but it's the tools, new tools, that change things the most. And so Quantified Self is really being ridden on the ability to quantify things, the technology of quantification and sensing. And so what we're seeing again is, I'm sure some 3 talks this evening will talk about we're using some technology in some ways to quantify things that may not have been possible even a few years ago. So with this quantification is very interesting because it's allowing us to do things as part of science that we've never done before. There's always been introspection. We were always very clear that there's many ways to know yourself besides quantification: meditation, self-reflection, journaling, art. But the new science of these tools allows us to use quantification as a means of knowing, and it's not just ourselves that will change. Is that part of the whole excitement of Quantified Self is that it actually is changing some of the ways that we do science. And an example of that would be that in the normal way of doing science is you do it with many examples. And you're studying populations, or you're studying many cases, but in Quantified Self you have an N of 1. There's only one of you, and that is a different kind of science, where you have n equals 1. And so that presents challenges and opportunities, where you're actually trying to do an experiment with a case of 1. The other thing that it introduces is we have self-experimentation. Self-experimentation has kind of an interesting, colorful history in the early days of amateur scientists. You know, the gentleman scientists of England and Europe. But we can return to that, where you actually do self-experimentation. That also, there are again challenges and opportunities that come from learning how to do that. But in even other ways, the science of quantified self is also engineering some other different methods in how we know things. There was one of the talks that was in the last couple of months, or at least in the last year, in Quantified Self Bay Area, I think. Maybe guys even here, I don't know. But he was doing experiments with multiple variables. Again, the standard dogma of science is that you isolate and you do experiment on a single variable. But if you're doing an N1 experiment, who has time so you can actually do experiments with multiple variables? And trying to use math and other mechanisms to unravel the fact that you have multiple variables. So these are just suggestions that this idea of experimenting on yourself with a single case is actually at the frontier of changing the scientific method. And one of the things we have to understand is that the scientific method has been changing all along. It's some of the most essential, crucial elements of what we consider the scientific method, particularly say in medicine, are very recent inventions, like the double blind or the placebo. Those are all things that were invented in the last 60 years. So we think of them as essential, but they're new. And so we're going to be changing the method of science through the quantified self work. So that's one thing. And the last part of it, of course, is that it's citizen science. This idea that everybody can use the scientific method, can use science to try and know even themselves. Okay, so that's another element of the quantified self that I think is very exciting. And the third and last thing I'd say about the interesting future of where quantification is going is that the quantifiable aspect of it, the fact that it's in numbers, it may actually only be a temporary scaffolding thing to something else. So let me see if I can explain that. If you can imagine that you're getting all this data about your heartbeat or your hormone levels or your activity or maybe your location, your genes that are changing all the time, and some of this is changing all the time. One way to see that is in rows of numbers, which we have a very difficult time in absorbing. You could make graphs which are more visual and are easier to absorb, but I take a lot of inspiration from one of the talks many years ago at a Quantified Self about the hack over a noise bridge where, I can't remember his name, but he made a belt that responded to a compass and would basically tingle his body in different directions whenever he was facing north. Okay, so he was taking the digital compass that would sense north, and he would transfer that signal away from numbers into something that he could feel. And so he found out that within a very short time, like maybe only a month, he was not even conscious of feeling it. He just knew where north was. It was a new sense for him. We'd say north? Yeah, it's right there. How do I know? I don't know. I just know. That's because his body was telling him those numbers, that quantification had been transferred back into the senses. And I think a lot of what we're going to see with the quantified self and the self-tracking stuff is that where it gets to the point where we can actually take that information, very complicated stuff, and make it into a sense that we sense and feel rather than something that we have to kind of process with numbers in our brains. So it's the same, it's kind of, in that sense, it moves away from the quantification where the quantification is only an interim step and we're actually acquiring new senses. And that brings us to I'll answer the questions in just a minute, I'm going to stop. To the last part, which is the self. So we have the quantified and the self. And I think that, to me, is the most interesting thing that this is doing, is that we are, in some ways, redefining, expanding, augmenting, leveraging, amplifying, and certainly altering the sense of the self, what we think the self is. And that is, as we bring all this information, as we extend our own attention into these devices which are going into the environment, we are enlarging our sense of where we are, and as we can see from these kind of social stuff, I don't know if there's seats, there may be some seats over here, and there's one back there. We don't know where we begin and others end, and that kind of mixing or that kind of diffusion of the boundary, which has been happening historically for a long time, is being accelerated. And the sense in which, as we not only are quantifying ourselves, but the environment is also tracking us. And so this is the other thing that's happening, is we have to understand the quantified self is happening inside a quantified century, where, from the GPS in your phone to your activity online to driving your car outside in your genes, all this stuff is being collected about us. And if we are again going to ourselves use information about us that someone else tracks, we're indirectly quantifying ourselves with other people's activities, doing the measuring and the monitoring. That also enlarges us. Again, that changes our definition of who we are as somebody that's kind of isolated and separate into something that is a wider entity. So that evolution of the self, I think, is another element of what's going on with the quantified self. So those are some remarks. This is not the usual quantified self talk. What we want from the show and tells is very simple. We have 3 general rules not rules, but they're rules of thumb, guidelines that make a great talk, and that is, tell us what you did, tell us what you learned, and then tell us how it changed your behavior. So that's the formula that seems to work really great. Try to keep philosophizing like I just did to a minimum. And so with that, I think we'll do the 3-word introductions, and we can do it very fast. You know about me, so the idea again is 3 words for those who just came in, your name, and 3 words about stuff that you're interested in right now. We're going to go like a raster back and forth, and that will kind of alert people what we're interested in doing. So I'm going to start from singly there on your t-shirt. You might want to stand up or make sure people in the back can hear you.